Hello everyone, I'm Richard Gon of Work to Live podcast version. This time, I don't talk about porn stuff, which means I'm a adult content creator, but this time what I talk about is different from porn content or adult content. So if you'd like to listen to episodes related to porn content or adult contents or adult businesses, please close or please stop playing this episode. So this time, what I'm going to talk about is Asian language, or which language to study if you are interested in Asian languages, and so the conclusion of this episode is you should learn Chinese language at first. So, and I will explain the reason. And first of all, and before explaining the reasons, let me tell you the presumable condition of this episode. So if I said Asian languages, and but some people, I think the listeners listening to this episode are maybe Western people, which means some some of you are some of you living, or some of you are from the United States of America, or some other English speaking nations, or in some and some people are from other European countries who who who, who speak who speak different languages from English. So for example, some people, maybe in in the case of my podcast, maybe some the majority people are the majority people are from English speaking nations, but the except the native speakers of English, some the, maj- the largest number of the native speakers are German, which means the largest population of my viewers viewers, or no, largest population of my podcast podcast and the except and eliminating the listeners from English speaking nations, the largest population is German people in the case of my podcast. I don't know whether I can talk about this kind of thing or not, but I don't care of that. And and going back to the original topic, I said Asian countries. So some people may imagine that Middle East countries are included into Asian countries, but in this case, I'd like to limit the range to only to East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. So if you categorize the Middle East countries where people speak Arabic languages, or in some cases, so maybe some countries belonged to Soviet Union decades before, and there are some countries which are categorized into Asian countries, but once which are part of Soviet Union. I don't include those past Soviet Union countries into this topic. So please think please think that the Asian countries I talk about are China and other East Asian countries like Korea and Japan, and Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, or countries like what other those countries, including Indonesia. So first, and going back to the original topic, so the first language, if you are interested in Asian languages, or if you are interested in learning Asian languages, the first language you should learn is Chinese. And first of all, Chinese is really difficult, but you don't have to acquire all the Chinese languages. You don't have to become proficient so much. You don't have to be proficient so much. Of course, I don't know much. I don't know much about Chinese language. I have studied Chinese, so I can speak sort of Chinese language, but I'm not proficient in Chinese so much that much. So in my case, my first language anyway, my mother tongue is Japanese, and other languages and other languages anyway, except for Japanese language. The language I can speak at most is this language, which means English. So anyway, so why you should learn Chinese language is because let me tell you an example of European cultures. So I'm not an expert of history of Europe. I'm not an expert of history, but maybe you know that because you are from some European countries. So in the case of European countries, each language influenced each other. Like as you know, in the case of English has many words meaning the same concept or same meaning, and like English, English has some words coming from different cultures. Like some English words are from Germanic cultures or Germanic group of Germanic languages. Some English words are from Germanic languages, and other words stem from Latin languages, like Latin languages. In this episode, the Latin languages are French, Italy, and Spanish, and other. Maybe there are many Latin languages out there, but I don't know. I don't know all of the Latin languages, and Portuguese is another Latin language, and in the case of Germanic language, German is one of the Germanic languages, and another example is maybe so maybe I don't know much about Nordic languages, but maybe Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish are Danish languages are Germanic languages. I don't know whether those Nordic languages are categorized into Germanic languages, but those European languages influenced each other, which is how how the English was created and other European languages are created. But in the case of Asian culture, China is the largest, and China had been the most advanced country. This is a primal condition in the ancient time, was before 18 years or before 19, not before 18th century or 19th century, maybe long before, at least maybe 15th century or before China had been the most advanced country in Asia. China was the largest. China had been the largest, and people learned from people learned from China, and which is fine. So in the case of communications done by people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, Chinese is necessary. It's necessary to use Chinese, and to communicate, to enable the communications, to enable the communications among people having different cultures and different languages each other. Written communication is necessary. Written communication was necessary, which means diplomatic communications were done in Chinese language. Like maybe people exchange documents in the case of diplomatic communications. So in the case in which case Chinese documents are used. So Chinese documents mean those documents written by Chinese characters. So many Chinese characters were written in those documents. So for example, in the case of Japanese culture, in ancient time, people use, for example, smart people use Chinese characters, and they knew how to read kanji. They knew how to read kanji, so they knew how to read Chinese characters. And I said kanji, but kanji means Chinese characters. So Chinese character is Chinese language, which means in Chinese language kanjis or Chinese characters are called hanzi. Hanzi is Chinese character, and you know like which people from the rest of the Asian countries than China. So people the basic structure is that China is the center of the Asia. Also, China China is the Chinese people call themselves Zhonghua, which means the center of the world. So in the context of Chinese culture, China is the center of the world, and other countries are surrounding countries or groups. And in the ancient time, Chinese people had found other countries barbarous, and those barbarous people, including Japanese people, came into China, and those barbarous people learned Chinese culture, and like which other Asian people than Chinese people could learn advanced knowledge or advanced technology from China, which is how other countries could develop, and which is how Chinese language had widespread in the ancient time, which is why Japanese people and Korean people and other Asian countries have many words originated from Chinese language. So in the case of, for example, I said Hanzi, or meaning Chinese character, and Hanzi is read kanji in Japanese language, and in the case of Korean language, that is read hanja in Korean language. And like which please understand that if you'd like to learn Chinese language, Chinese character is a kind of communication platform on which people from different culture talk or communicate each other, regardless of verbal communications or verbal communication, anyway, written or audible communications. If those ancient people could pronounce Chinese languages or could speak Chinese language well, they can communicate each other. So no matter how, wherever they are from. I mean, I don't speak Chinese language, but in the ancient time, if I could speak Chinese language, I could communicate with, so for example, people from Korea, and by using Chinese language, and I could communicate. I could communicate, for example, people from Vietnam, if they could speak ancient Chinese language, like which Chinese language had been a communication platform on which other people could communicate each other, like which Asian countries are established. Asian countries are structured, and so the basic structure is such a thing, like other Asian countries obey or worship China, which is why we use part of Chinese languages. And the most one of the most worshipping country is as Japan and Korea. So in the case of Korean language, Korean language has actually has many words originated to in Chinese languages, and the manner of reading of Chinese characters in the case of Korean languages is really close to original Chinese language than Japanese language. And in another example, Goja is nation or country, and in Chinese language, Goja is pronounced Goja, And in the case of Japanese language, in Japanese language, that is read. In Japanese language, kokka, that is kokka. And in the case of Korean language, that is read, gukka. So really, the reading manners are really close. But in the case of the distance between Korean language and Chinese language and Japanese language and Chinese language, Korean Chinese language is closer than Japanese Chinese language. I mean, I compared the two linguistic distances. So, language, which means what I'd like to tell you is that you should learn Chinese language at first, and by which, if you like to learn other Asian languages, you can learn other Asian languages quite easily because you have knowledge of Chinese language. So, like in this case, in the case the words I told you, you can use those words because as there are really similar words to Chinese in Japanese language and Korean language. And in the case, I don't know much about Southeast Asian languages, but according to the information on the internet, the Vietnamese language is close to, or Vietnamese culture is close to Chinese culture, which is why I don't know. I haven't learned the Vietnamese language, but you may be able to acquire Vietnamese language by using Chinese languages. Like which, I will tell you the conclusion again. If you are interested in Asian languages, you should learn Chinese language at first before other Asian languages. No matter how hard the Chinese language is, you should start Chinese. You should start from learning Chinese language before starting from learning other languages. This is all. That's it. Thank you very much for your listening. See you.